There is a particular cruelty in timing, not the cruelty of malice, nothing so simple. The cruelty of coincidence, of the universe arranging its pieces without regard for meaning or fairness or the basic human expectation that joy, when it finally arrives after a long absence, should be allowed to stay. The cruelty of a man saying in the last week of his life that he was no longer afraid and meaning it completely, and being right about everything except how little time remained for that freedom to matter. In the first days of December 1980, John Lennon sat across from journalists and spoke with an openness that surprised people who thought they already knew him. He was 40 years old. His new album, Double Fantasy, had just been released. His son Sean was 5 and healthy and funny and learning to draw. He had been away from music for 5 years, and had come back not with the defensiveness of someone returning from defeat, but with the lightness of someone who had found something more important and was now choosing freely to return. He said in one of those interviews that he was not afraid anymore. He said it quietly, without drama, the way a person states a fact they have recently confirmed, not a declaration, not a performance. Just an observation from someone who had spent most of his life moving at the speed of fear, fear of failure, fear of exposure, fear of the silence that waited on the other side of the noise, and had, in 5 years of deliberate quiet, finally run out of things to be afraid of. 6 days later he was gone. What follows is not a story about an ending. It is a story about what a human being becomes when they have survived enough to finally tell the truth, and what it means that the truth was still being spoken when the time ran out. To understand what December 1980 meant, you have to understand what the previous 40 years had built and cost. John Winston Lennon was born on October 9, 1940, in Liverpool, England, a city being bombed into rubble by the German Luftwaffe while the rest of the world tried to hold itself together. His father, Freddie, was a merchant seaman who disappeared for months and then years. His mother, Julia, was warm and vivid and constitutionally unsuited to stability, the kind of woman who fills every room she enters with laughter and leaves it slightly colder when she goes. When John was 5, his parents separated. The question of who would raise him was settled by his Aunt Mimi, Julia's older sister, firm and practical and loving in the way that does not always look like love from the inside. Menlove Avenue, the semi-detached house called Mendips, the small garden, the radio in the kitchen. These were the coordinates of John's childhood, and they produced in him a particular quality that would define everything that came after, a hunger. Not the hunger of deprivation, exactly. Mimi kept him fed and clothed and educated and safe, but a hunger for something he could not name precisely, for the warmth that Julia brought and then took away when she left. For a father who existed in stories rather than rooms, for something to belong to that would not disappear. Music found him before he found it. Or perhaps it is more accurate to say that music was the first language he encountered that could carry what he was already feeling. When Julia played banjo in the front room and laughed too loud and let him stay up past midnight. Listening to Buddy Holly on the record player, something clicked into place that would never click out again. She taught him guitar chords on an instrument that cost almost nothing, her fingers guiding his, both of them laughing when he got it wrong. In July 1958, Julia Lennon stepped off the pavement outside Mimi's house and was struck by a car driven by an off-duty police officer. She died almost immediately. John was 17. He did not cry in public. He made sharper jokes. He played louder. He carried the loss the way a person carries something too heavy, by keeping moving, by not putting it down long enough to feel the full weight. The grief went underground and became energy, and the energy became music, and the music eventually became everything. But the everything came later. First there was the hunger and the guitar and a city that was slowly rebuilding itself from the rubble of the war, and a boy who had learned that the people you love most can simply be taken without warning or explanation. That knowledge, absorbed at 17, never fully metabolized, shaped every song he would ever write, every relationship he would ever have, every moment of fear and every moment of breakthrough that followed. It was always there. It was always underneath. And it was still there in December 1980, transmuted but present, when he sat across from journalists and spoke about not being afraid anymore. The Beatles happened the way certain things happen, not gradually but all at once, a transformation so complete and so fast that the world had barely registered the before it was already the after. By 1963, John Lennon was famous in Britain. By 1964, he was famous everywhere. The Ed Sullivan Show appearance in February of that year drew 73 million American viewers, a number so large it was essentially the whole country watching simultaneously, the whole country hearing four young men from Liverpool and deciding, collectively, that something had changed. John was 23. He was already married, secretly, to Cynthia Powell. Their son Julian had been born the year before. He was already carrying the weight of a public identity that bore only partial resemblance to the private one, the witty, charismatic, endlessly quotable Beatle who said exactly the right irreverent thing at exactly the right moment and made it look effortless. It was not effortless, but the effort was invisible, which was the point. The Beatles' years were an education in what fame actually is, as opposed to what it appears to be from the outside. From the outside, fame looks like arrival, like finally reaching the place you were always trying to get to. From the inside, John would later say, it felt more like acceleration. You kept moving, kept performing, kept giving, and the faster you went, the less you could feel what you were actually experiencing, until the speed itself became the only reality, and you forgot there had ever been anything else. He wrote some of the most enduring music of the 20th century during those years. He also lost things he would not be able to name as losses until much later. His first marriage dissolved under the pressure of his absence and his ambivalence. His relationship with Julian suffered the damage that a father too consumed by his own velocity inflicts on a child who simply needs him to be present. The band that had been his first real family, the structure that had replaced the one his childhood had failed to provide, began to fracture under the weight of everything they had become. By 1969, the Beatles were ending. The dissolution was public and painful and picked apart by a press that had always treated the band as public property. And at the center of every story about the ending was Yoko Ono, the woman John had married in March 1969, the woman the world had decided to blame for everything. The hostility toward Yoko was a specific kind of ugly, racial, misogynist, rooted in the assumption that the public owned John Lennon and that any woman who occupied his private life was a trespasser in something that belonged to them. John's defense of her was absolute and cost him social capital he had spent years accumulating. He didn't care, or rather, he cared and paid the price anyway, which is a different and more difficult thing. What no one could see from the outside, what the press coverage and the fan outrage and the cultural narrative completely missed, was that Yoko Ono was the first person in John Lennon's adult life who saw him clearly and said so. Not the Beatle, not the icon, not the witty provocateur or the protest singer or the living symbol of a generation's aspirations. The actual person. The complicated, wounded, brilliant, sometimes difficult actual person who had been carrying the weight of Julia's death and Freddie's absence and everything else since he was 17 years old. That clarity was the most valuable thing anyone had ever offered him, and it terrified him the way being truly seen always terrifies people who have spent their lives performing. But that was not the whole truth, because between the terror and the acceptance, there were years of genuine searching. The early 1970s were loud in every sense. John and Yoko moved to New York in 1971, drawn by the city's energy and its radical political culture and the simple practical fact that America was where the music industry's center of gravity lay. They threw themselves into activism, anti-war demonstrations, benefit concerts, public statements on everything from the Nixon administration to prison reform. John wrote protest songs that hit like accusations. He gave interviews that were simultaneously brilliant and combative, funny and furious, marked by the quality of someone who has decided to stop being careful. The Nixon administration, alarmed by his influence, initiated deportation proceedings against him. The fight to remain in the United States consumed 4 years of his life. During that time, he and Yoko separated. Briefly, 18 months during which John was in Los Angeles with May Pang, a period he later described with characteristic honesty as the most confused and least purposeful of his life. He was unmoored. The clarity that Yoko had provided was absent, and in its absence he could feel the old hunger again, the shapeless thing that fame had never filled and that the music could only temporarily satisfy. They reconciled in 1975. In October of that year, Sean Taro Ono Lennon was born, and something shifted in John Lennon that the music he had written until then had been pointing toward without quite arriving at. He made a decision. He would stop. He would step away from the identity that had consumed him since he was a teenager. He would not record, not tour, not give interviews or write anthems or be the living symbol of anything except a father who showed. Up for his child, he would bake bread and walk through Central Park and read books that had nothing to do with the music industry and learn what it felt like to exist without the noise. 5 years of deliberate, chosen quiet. What he found there would take the rest of his life, however much remained of it, to fully articulate. The Dakota is a building that carries history the way old buildings carry cold, in its walls, in its angles, in the particular quality of its shadows. It stands on the Upper West Side of Manhattan at 72nd Street and Central Park West, its Gothic towers rising above the treeline of the park with an authority that feels simultaneously welcoming and forbidding. John and Yoko had lived there since 1973. By 1975, with Sean newly born, it had become something different than an address. It had become a world. Routines of those 5 years were small and deliberate and almost aggressively ordinary. John woke early. He made breakfast. He took Sean to his music lessons and waited in the hallway, just another parent, unremarkable except to anyone who looked closely enough to recognize the face. He went to the bakery on the corner. He read. He wrote in journals that mixed grocery lists with passages of such unexpected emotional clarity that the people who later encountered them described the experience as disorienting, like finding a Rembrandt in a shoebox. He called people he had not spoken to in years. Some calls were warm and straightforward. Some were attempts at repair, reaching toward Julian, toward old friends the velocity of the Beatles' years had left behind, toward the versions of relationships that had been casualties of everything else. Not all of. These attempts landed the way he intended. The distance that years of absence create is real, and good intentions delivered late do not always dissolve it. But the attempts were made. The reaching happened, which was more than the younger John, defended behind his wit and his speed, had been capable of, and he wrote, not for the public, not yet, for himself. Into notebooks, onto the backs of envelopes, into the small cassette recorder he kept by the bed for the 3 in the morning moments when something arrived and demanded to be caught before it dissolved. Songs that were tender in ways his earlier work had not allowed itself to be. Reflections on fatherhood, on stillness, on the specific texture of ordinary mornings, on what it felt like to have spent decades being famous and to discover on the other side of all that noise that the things that actually mattered fit in a very small space. He was not afraid, he would later say. For the first time in as long as he could remember, he was not afraid. This was new. This was the most radical thing the boy from Menlove Avenue had ever achieved, more radical than any protest, more radical than any anthem, more radical than any act of public defiance. The achievement of genuine, unperformed peace with his own existence. And then in 1980, the music started calling again. Double Fantasy was recorded over the summer and autumn of 1980 at the Hit Factory studio in New York. John approached the sessions differently than he had approached any previous recording. There was no urgency, no point to prove, no audience to shock or movement to lead or identity to defend or establish. There was just the music and the pleasure of making it and the sense of someone returning to a thing they love after a long absence and finding it still there, still good, still worth the return. The songs he brought to the sessions were unlike anything in his previous catalog. Warmer, more direct, less armored, watching the wheels addressed with almost embarrassing honesty the 5 years away, the questions people had asked, the assumptions they had made, the gap between what they had expected of him and what he had actually been doing. Beautiful Boy was a lullaby for Sean, simple and unguarded, saying exactly what it meant with no subtext and no irony. Woman was a love song to Yoko that did not try to be clever, that simply said, "You are the reason things are better than they were." These were not the songs of a man performing happiness. They were the songs of a man who had arrived somewhere and was trying to describe what it looked like from the inside. Double Fantasy was released on November 17, 1980. The reviews were mixed. Some critics found the warmth too comfortable, the edges too smoothed. John read the reviews and disagreed, and said so with characteristic directness in the interviews he gave in the weeks that followed. Those interviews, those last interviews. They were conducted in the first days of December 1980 in the Dakota apartment in offices over the phone. John was relaxed in a way that startled people who had expected the sharpness, the wit deployed as armor, the quick deflection dressed as honesty. Instead, there was something quieter and more available. He talked about Sean with a specificity that was almost domestic, what the boy had said that morning, what he was learning, how his laugh sounded. He talked about Oko with a simplicity that was, for a man who had spent decades speaking in epigrams, almost radical. He talked about the 5 years away as the best thing he had ever done and meant it without qualification. He said he was not afraid. He said the worst had already happened, not meaning December 8th, which was still 6 days away and unimaginable, but meaning everything before. The losses, the fractures, the years of moving too fast to feel anything real. He had survived all of it. He had come through to the other side of it and found, waiting there, something ordinary and sufficient and genuinely his own. He was 40 years old. He had just found the answer to a question he had been asking since he was 17. He had, in the last week of his life, arrived, and then the timing did what timing does. On December 8th, 1980, John Lennon was shot outside the Dakota building as he returned home from a recording session. This story does not live in that moment. It cannot. The loss was too large and too sudden and too final for narrative to hold it properly, and the attempt to hold it tends to produce something that serves the story more than it serves the truth. What the story holds instead is everything before that moment. The full weight of what had been built and broken and rebuilt and finally, in those last days, allowed to simply be. Julian Lennon has carried his father's legacy with the complexity it deserves, aware of both the icon and the man who was absent, grieving both the loss and the relationship that had never been fully repaired. The love was real, so was the wound. Both things are true simultaneously, and Julian has refused to flatten either one. Sean Lennon grew up to be a musician, his father's face and his father's instinct for the emotionally direct line that lands because it is not trying to land. He has spoken of those Dakota years with a warmth that confirms what the journals suggest, that John Lennon in those 5 years was genuinely present, that the choice to be a father rather than an icon was honored in the daily reality of a boy going to the bakery in the morning with his father hearing music played for no one except the room. Yoko Ono has kept the work alive with a fidelity that is itself a form of love, the archives, the exhibitions, the insistence that the message, however imperfectly lived by the man who carried it, was and remains worth carrying. And the music plays, across 50 years, in spaces private and public, in grief and in hope. Imagine in the square, in my life at the funeral. Beautiful boy in the quiet of a room where a parent watches a child sleep and understands, perhaps for the first time, what John Lennon understood in the Dakota, that this, exactly this, is what was worth being afraid to lose. He said he was not afraid anymore. He was right. Whatever was taken on December 8th, 1980, the fear had already been released. The peace had already been achieved. The man who had spent 40 years moving at the speed of grief had, in the last chapter of his life, finally stopped, had sat down, had let himself be ordinary and sufficient and present and grateful, had told the truth. The interviews played on the radio after he was gone, and people heard them differently than they had heard them a week before. The voice was the same. The words were the same, but the timing had changed everything, as timing always does. Giving the words a weight they were not carrying when they were spoken, turning a simple statement of personal fact into something that would outlast the man who made it. I am not afraid. 4 words spoken in early December 1980 by a man who had earned them. 4 words that have been ringing in the silence ever since. What does it mean to arrive at peace in the last week of your life? What does it mean to finally tell the truth when the time left to live it is almost gone? Perhaps it means that the truth was worth telling regardless, that the arriving mattered even without the staying, that 40 years of searching, converted finally into 4 honest words, is enough, more than enough, to leave behind. John Lennon left behind much more than 4 words, but those 4 words, spoken in that last interview in that last week, are where the story finds its resting place. He was not afraid. He never had to be again.